Ok, estamos online. Ok, beleza, nós estamos online. Boa tarde a todos, sejam muito bem-vindos. Meu nome é Régis, esse é o Seminários Abertos das Letras, um projeto interdisciplinar conduzido por professores da Letras da Universidade Federal de Santa Maria. Hoje nós temos uma palestra em inglês e hoje nós não temos interpretação. Toda a nossa introdução hoje será feita em português e na sequência a gente segue com a nossa palestra em língua inglesa e com as questões também em língua inglesa. Tá? Só um instante. Ok. A nossa palestra tem duração de 1 hora, seguidas depois de 30 minutos de debate. Então, se você tem perguntas, se você, quando está assistindo a gente, está acompanhando o evento, tem questões, tem perguntas para a professora, você pode fazer ela pelo chat. Essa pergunta chega para mim e ela é lida, durante a nossa transmissão. Esse é o nosso seminário número 27. Toda semana a gente traz um conteúdo diferente das letras, seja tradução, literatura, linguística, ensino. A gente navega por todas as divisões, por todos os campos das letras. Hoje é o nosso seminário final de 2020, mas a gente continua em 2021 com outros conteúdos, com outras palestras, com mais informação trazida toda semana aqui no YouTube. Após os cerca de 50, 60 minutos, quando finda a palestra, é colocado no chat um link para os certificados. Então, se você precisa de certificado, você precisa de um documento que ateste sua presença aqui nos seminários, ateste sua participação, fique ligado aqui no chat que pode estar à sua direita ou abaixo da tua tela, depende do seu dispositivo. né? Quando esse link aparecer, você tem ainda alguns minutos para preencher, e nesse link você pode informar para a gente o que você achou do evento, o que achou da palestra, o que tem achado dos seminários. Se você tem sugestões de temas, sugestões de palestrantes, tem um espaço reservado ali para essas informações. Né? Muitos dos palestrantes, muitos temas que foram sugeridos, que vieram para a gente através do formulário de feedback, acabaram ganhando espaço, acabaram ganhando vez aqui nos seminários. Então, a gente está aberto para receber essas sugestões, críticas, né, recomendações, né? Nosso evento gira em torno do termo aberto, a gente não cobra inscrição, a gente traz pessoas de todo o país, a gente traz alguns convidados, como o caso de hoje, de fora do Brasil, né? Você pode acessar do seu celular, pode acessar do seu computador, da sua televisão, né? Nós trabalhamos aí com toda essa variedade da abertura de letras, né? Uma palavra aberta no sentido geral. Esse é um projeto que eu tenho muito orgulho, estou muito feliz de ter conduzido esse projeto com essas 27 semanas que a gente teve junto, milhares de pessoas participaram, são milhares de participações e certificados de horas, tudo numa escala muito grandiosa, né? Eu agradeço a presença constante de vocês, se vocês não estão aqui constantemente, vêm esporadicamente também, muito obrigado. Se vocês estão acompanhando a gente, lembra de se inscrever no canal, de clicar no like, né, para a gente poder manter esse projeto sempre aberto, sempre funcionando, sempre rodando. If you are following us from another country and not understand anything that I'm saying, don't worry. And the lecture will be in English. I'm just finishing some housekeeping before we move to the interesting part of today's talk. And you have Claire talking about typography to you. So, without further ado, I will introduce Claire, and then we have our lecture today. It's a great pleasure to have Claire here, and I'm thankful to finish 2020 with Claire's seminar today. Claire Bourne is an assistant professor of English at University of Pennsylvania. Her interests and teaching concentrates on Shakespeare, early modern drama, the history of the book, theater history, and textual editing. Her first monograph appeared in 2020, published by Oxford University Press, entitled Typographies of Performance in Early Modern England. She received several fellowships through her career, and she has published extensively on early modern book design and reading practice in venues such as PBSA, ELR, Shakespeare, and a number of edited collections. She's been preparing a new edition of the first part of Henry VI for Arden Shakespeare, the 4th series. She also finished an edition of Fletcher and Messenger's The Sea Voyage for the new Routledge Anthology of Early Modern Drama to 2020. Claire is also the general editor of the digital Belmont and Fletcher 1647, a digital humanities project that publishes open access student-generated editions of plays from Belmont and Fletcher's in Fletcher's first folio for the use in the classroom. Her second book project, tentatively entitled Accidental Shakespeare, is about the role of textual accident in editorial tradition. You may have heard about some of Claire's fantastic discoveries, as she was one of the investigators that led to the discovery of a copy of Shakespeare's first folio that was once owned and annotated by no less than John Milton. Claire's work and projects have been illuminating the range of possibilities that involve textual studies in a fresh and stimulating way. I'm glad that I have the pleasure of working with her and that she's together with us today giving a talk at Seminários Abertos das Letras. Today, Claire brings up one important topic for textual studies, typography, in a talk named Literature and Typography, Designs for Play Reading in Early Modern England. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I know we've had, gone back and forth on scheduling this, so I'm really pleased that we found a time in 2020 to be able to get together this way. All right, so I'm going to share some slides with you. You won't see me as I share the slides. You'll just hear me. I've never used this particular software before, but hopefully it'll all go smoothly. So let me share this and then I'll get started. All right, so just let me know if you can't see the slides. So what I'm going to present today is actually some material from the book, my book that was published this year, as well as some material that I'm thinking about for the next book. I'm a specialist on early modern drama and book history, so typography and literature is obviously a very broad topic, and I could situate a discussion anywhere in literary history, but I'm mostly going to be talking about the 16th century, the 17th century, and then I'll end with a moment of Shakespeare editing in the 18th century. So my talk today draws from research I did for my book, Typographies of Performance in Early Modern England, in which I argue that typography, broadly defined as the disposition of printed matter on the page, was purposely mobilized by the makers of early modern play books to make the non-verbal, meaning-making dimensions of theatricality legible to readers. Based on an original survey of almost 2,000 unique copies of playbooks published in England between the late 15th century and the early 18th century, I've been able to identify moments of typographic experimentation and track when those experiments fail or calcify into conventions we recognize today as a uniquely dramatic typography. So when you open an edition of Shakespeare, for example, you know that the text you're looking at is a play without even reading a word on the page because of how it's laid out on the page. Some of the examples I will discuss feature in the book, while others gesture towards a second major book project called Accidental Shakespeare. This new project posits that the Shakespearean text and our shifting understandings of textual authority around a canonical figure like Shakespeare has always been contingent on, one, the accidents, that is, errors of textual production, and two, the features of early texts known in editorial circles as accidentals, such as punctuation, typeface, and page design, that were for a very long time dismissed for having little or no connection to the author, and indeed for obscuring authorial meaning. So part of my goal is to recover these really interesting moments of textual making. So attending to the processes, however messy, by which plays were designed to be read in book form can help us reclaim some of those accidental features of the text in our editorial practices and bring drama's two primary media, theater and book, into closer conversation. Furthermore, situating these designs for play reading alongside evidence of actual play reading, which is where I've been directing a lot of my attention this year, promises to bring an ever more diverse set of voices and hands from the past, especially those of women, into our ongoing conversations about how plays become capital L literature. So the recent discovery that John Milton was the annotator of a marked up copy of the Shakespeare First Folio at the Free Library of Philadelphia confirms that readers, whether we know who they were or not, do unexpected and peculiar things to the text they read. And I'm more than happy to answer questions about the Milton Shakespeare Folio in the Q&A if that's something you're interested in hearing more about. So developing methods of critical reading and editing that take these various and variable encounters seriously, rather than relegating them as belated and then therefore unauthorized, animates my personal interest in playbooks as material objects. The dirtier they are, the more marked up they are, the better. However, if we are to read early modern readers reading their playbooks, we first need to know how those playbooks, not just the words on their pages, but also the variety of typographic strategies that allowed plays written for performance to be made legible as plays in print. So before we study how they were actually read, we have to study how they were designed to be read. And it's to that endeavor that I now turn. A very famous bibliographer once declared that the makers of early modern playbooks were, quote, largely indifferent to the quite specific requirements in book design of dramatic texts. In other words, they were not interested in the extra effort that would have been required to make such books properly recognizable and navigable as plays. Still, the title pages of most professional playbooks claim some kind of equivalency between page and stage, as it hath been performed, often lately sundry or diverse times, played, showed, acted, publicly, privately, before the Queen. So many of these title pages make some kind of claim about the book itself being a version of what was performed on stage. The earliest iterations of this formula promised readerly access to an exclusive performance event. For example, a staging of Gorboduc for Queen Elizabeth at Whitehall, which you see here. The Three Ladies of London, published in 1584, was the first playbook to feature the formula without a reference to a particular event, just says, as it hath been publicly played. So not in this particular moment before the Queen, but just as it hath been publicly played. And Richard Jones's 1590 edition of Part 1 and 2 of Tamburlaine made this claim even less specific by advertising that the octavo presents the plays, quote, as they were sundry times, so many times showed upon stages in the city of London. Jones's particular formulation suggests that what was set forth in the book was a general version, not a specific instance of the play. This move towards generalizing became a template for performance claims on the title pages of subsequent playbooks. The as in as it hath been diverse times acted on the title page of the first quarto of Hamlet, for instance, insists that the book is not a stage, at the same time as it suggests a connection between what Hamlet audiences might have seen in London, Oxford, Cambridge, or other places, and the quarto called Hamlet that came to press in 1603. Typography, I argue, made such a correspondence possible. If the printed text was recognizable as a play, it could be read as a play. Features of page design as mundane to us as the use of indents to articulate a change in speaker, and the use of different typefaces to differentiate dialogue from speaker names and stage directions supported a lot of cognitive labor from readers encountering printed plays for the first time. The generalized version of the as it was played formula does not claim that the book is, or ever could be, a detailed record of a particular performance. But that, in a way, is how the designs of early modern playbooks have always been judged, as, quote, diminished things, or afterthoughts, or emaciated surrogates of the fully embodied, multisensory theatrical event. I would argue that these assessments have much more to do with the contents of early editions disappointing us, what we want to find in them about Shakespeare and about what Shakespeare intended, than it does with them having disappointed the readers for whom they were made. So instead of striving and failing to account for exactly how the play was performed then, the makers of early modern playbooks capitalized, quite literally, they made money out of typography as a means of instantiating the signifying aspects of early modern theatricality. And by theatricality, I mean the meaning-making work of what Henry Turner has called objects, bodies, conventions, signs, and collective habits of apprehending performance. Printers, publishers, and other agents of the book trade recognized, as the great theater historian W.B. Worthen has put it, that writing is merely one of many materials, not the abstract cause or governing logos of the stage, but another kind of raw material, like lumber and canvas or theater space, or even the actors' bodies, that is refashioned and resignified in the rigorously pragmatic working out of the creative business of the playing. For a book to be a play, it had to express something of this, quote, creative business. These efforts were usually localized and sometimes idiosyncratic, and because of this, have been too easy to ignore or dismiss as vagaries of the printing house and contamination of authorial intention. Again, our desires, not early modern readers' desires. Some of these typographic arrangements are simply just so conventional to our eyes that we do not even notice them enough to think about how they came about. And even the most conventional features of playbook page design were once experimental. And it is this kind of play, playing with play matter, typographic trial and error, that I want to discuss with you today. So this talk consists of 3 parts and a conclusion. So each of these parts will address the typographic mediation, so the transfer from the stage to the page, of one key feature of early modern theatricality. So first I'll talk about speech, then I'll talk about the body, and then I'll talk about stage architecture. So part 1, speech, we might call it voice as well. The first printers of English plays used Pilcrows, that backwards P symbol, paragraph mark, to articulate the discursive form, the dialogic form of Tudor morality plays and interludes. Judging from the various patterns of Pilcrow use in late medieval manuscript plays, what constituted a paragraph or a basic formal unit of dramatic material was an open question at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 16th century. So we're about 100 years before Shakespeare here. But printers ultimately isolated the speech, whether one line or many, as drama's equivalent of the paragraph, by situating Pilcrows at the start of every new unit of dialogue. They did so because these plays, like many scholastic manuscripts that were rubricated to mark discrete stages in an argument, rehearsed the workings out of answers to important spiritual and ethical questions. The Pilcrows, which on this image you see as these C, they look like C symbols here, but these are precursors to that backwards P symbol. The Pilcrows helped readers navigate what would otherwise have been a single undifferentiated column of text, given that speaker names were typically printed in the outer margin of every page. Printers and publishers solved the problem of making these texts legible as plays and got around having to include reading tutorials by appealing to readers' established proficiencies. So readers of these plays would have known how to navigate this textual arrangement from other print genres. And as such, it was designed to ease them into that liminal space between page and stage, between the material book and the idea of performance that play reading entailed. Then, as now, typography operated as its own set of instructions for play reading. So in the middle of the 16th century, several related factors spurred changes in the way Pilcrows were deployed to structure the act of play reading. So these are just a couple of examples here of the use of Pilcrows in these very early, quite rare playbooks. So there were some changes in how Pilcrows were used. In some cases, printers did not have enough actual pieces of Pilcrow type in their inventory to implement a complete treatment of the play's dialogue, so to have a Pilcrow next to every new unit of speech. This is perhaps most evident in the third quarto edition of a play called Like Will to Like, published in 1587, where printer Edward Aldie used two different kinds of Pilcrows, one with a single descender, a single line down, and one with two descenders, two lines down, and also enlisted a symbol called a double dagger to stand in for Pilcrows so that he could articulate the beginning of every new speech. So Aldie used the second edition of Like Will to Like. So remember, he's printing the third. He's looking at the second one, printed by his father, John, as his copy text. But he made a few choice adjustments to the typography, where John, this is on the left, boxed in stage directions with vertical and horizontal lines to set them off from dialogue, possibly replicating the design of his manuscript. Edward opted to set the directions in Roman and surround them with braces or brackets to differentiate them from black letter dialogue. So that's on the right. He also set the speaker names in Roman type, where his father had also set them in black letter. Edward's careful use of different typefaces means that the entire non-lexical apparatus of the edition reads categorically differently from the dialogue, and was very much on trend for shifting textual presentation of plays in the 1580s. So speech prefix, stage directions, those are all in Roman type, while the dialogue is in black letter type. Even though he modified the page design of his copy text, Edward did not go so far as to dispense with Q2's Pilcrows. In fact, he must have considered them important enough to the book's design protocols that he not only preserved them, but also improvised with other special character sorts available to him when he realized that he would not have enough pieces of type to do a thorough job. So Edward Aldie's use of other special characters to function like Pilcrows in his edition of Like Will to Like is atypical, but it underscores the salience of the readerly assistance that Pilcrows provided. While some printers continued to articulate dialogue by situating Pilcrows at the start of new speeches as late as the 1580s, so this is just as Shakespeare's career is starting, others opted against using Pilcrows altogether. Take, for example, the first quarto of Lusty Juventus, published by Abraham Veal in 1551. Printed by John Wyer, the quarto is notable for its relative lack of Pilcrows. Wyer seems to have started out, don't want to go there yet. Wyer seems to have started out with the intention of using Pilcrows in conventional ways. He deploys them to divide the prologue into stanzas and to articulate units of dialogue on the first two pages, after which they just disappear. Because speaker names are situated in the outer margins, the body of dialogue in this edition risked reading like that single undifferentiated column of text if not given a special typographic treatment. It is indeed possible that Wyer did not have enough Pilcrow type sorts to see his intentions through. But his solution to this problem was not to improvise with other symbols, but instead to leave a space at the beginning of the first line of each speech, a space we now recognize as an indent. This arrangement is not uncommon in mid-century playbooks that recognize the functionality of Pilcrows by beginning to use them or by using them sporadically throughout the book and then defaulting to indents. Playbooks that began this way with recognizable patterns of Pilcrow use, as well as those in which such patterns appear only intermittently, once again ease readers, whether purposely or inadvertently, from a by then established page design protocol to a different kind of textual scaffolding. This was a visual scheme that relied on visual absence instead of presence, but it was purposeful. The indent is not just nothing. Setting type to produce a blank space required of the compositor about the same amount of labor as setting a Pilcrow. In the absence of Pilcrows, the blank spaces we now called indents came to do the textual work of dividing speeches. Like situating a Pilcrow at the head of a unit of text, indenting a line marked the, quote, beginning of new matter, as Joseph Moxon wrote in 1683. And so this quotation in 1683 is actually the first instance of the word indent in English being used to describe this textual arrangement. As with most typographic change, the blank space took hold slowly and unevenly. Between about 1550 and 1590, the layout of dialogue in relation to speaker names varied widely. By the 1590s, speaker names had migrated from the margins to the center of the page, and then into the block of dialogue itself, which you see on the right in Romeo and Juliet, where they came to be italicized in the case of Roman dialogue and set in Roman in the case of blackletter dialogue. They were often abbreviated, and most notably, because so often overlooked, they were indented. It took Pilcrows almost 4 decades to phase out of playbooks completely, although there are a few stragglers in Shakespeare quartos as late as 1611. Pericles' edition of 1611 has some lovely Pilcrows in it. Coupled with the constraints of type supply and a variety of new ways to divide dialogue on the page, readers' increasing proficiency with indents may have been what ultimately made Pilcrows redundant. Readers grew used to reading the spaces, whether by necessity or by design, as stand-ins for Pilcrows, and therefore equally effective at articulating dialogue. In this way, Pilcrows did not so much disappear from the pages of printed plays as they were replaced by an even more powerful and flexible graphic sign, the blank space, that would persist as a convention of rendering dialogue in print for the next 400 years. So part 2, body. Some early modern playwrights did not hesitate to point out that print could not possibly account for what the playwright John Webster called the significance of stage action. Still, early modern playbooks more generally show a range of typographic strategies aimed at making the impacts of nonverbal business, such as gesture, legible to readers. Print could obviously not reproduce the liveness of stage business, but it could account for its presence, its timing, and its effects. One of the most common strategies of signaling the timing of action with speech was the use of what we call turnovers and turn-unders. So this is a mode of presenting text on the page. While these may seem like inconsequential contingencies of printing, they are actually an effective barometer of how sensitive some printers could be to the demands of making theatricality legible on the page. So as you see here, turnovers and turn-unders, it's what you see all the way on the right of the page, were typically used to maintain the integrity of lines of verse that exceeded the width of the text block. But they were also used in some printed plays to deal with stage directions when the printed area was too narrow for a side-by-side arrangement. In such cases, the compositor would turn the stage direction over or under the line of dialogue to which it corresponded and use a single parenthesis to preserve a visual connection between speech and business. For example, in The True Tragedy of Richard III, the single parenthesis around exit Casby indicates that the exit belongs with the line set above the direction. Casby should be gone by the time Richard begins trying to persuade himself of his claim to the throne. I'm just going to show you a few examples of this. In John Marston's The Dutch Courtesan, a turn-under signals that the sound of the nightingale's song should begin with Malraux's hark on the line above where it is printed. And in the 5th quarto of Edward IV, Jane's act of kneeling is described in a direction set on the line below where she begins beseeching the king to excuse her boldness. But that single parenthesis signals that her kneeling should be coordinated with the beseeching. Parenthesis was what George Putnam in the period wrote, quote, a figure of tolerable disorder. It's one of my favorite phrases from all of early modern writing. The parenthesis is a figure of tolerable disorder. Indeed, in the case of turned over and turned under stage directions, the single parenthesis kept in check the possibility that print might distort the play, particularly the theatrical effect of well-timed action. By creating noticeable connections between dialogue and action, turnovers and turn-unders mitigated the loss threatened by the accidents of printing. Ben Jonson, our favorite, also experimented with parentheses and also with dashes in the early quartos of his comical satires to encode the disruptive effects of the intemperate and unruly body. So these are some of my favorite examples. In Every Man Out of His Humor, the character Fastidious Brisk interrupts his own speech each time he takes a puff of tobacco from his pipe, where the action of taking tobacco is rendered typographically by open parenthesis TAB, period, close parenthesis. While his preoccupation with smoking would have manifested itself for theater audiences through repeated gesture, here on the page, the repetition of this parenthetical abbreviation permits readers to see the physical signs of his addiction in textual form. So the appearance of the TAB 15 times on 2 quarto pages typographically registers this frenetic quality of his habit. Massalente's joke, which I've pointed to here at the top of the left page, Massalente's joke that, quote, he ne'er knew tobacco taken as parenthesis before, draws attention to the typographical composition of the page, where Brisk's act of taking tobacco is literally bracketed again and again as it breaches his speech. So it's both a rhetorical joke and a textual joke that Massalente makes. So Jonson redoubled his efforts to develop a typography of humorous action in Cynthia's Revels a year later, where 2 of the boy actors in the play's preludium attempt to interrupt the third. These physical interruptions are marked by dashes as a note to the reader explained, and that's what I've highlighted in yellow here. At the breaches in the speech following, the other 2 boys interrupt him. By calling the dashes breaches, Jonson implied that the actions they accounted for disturbed or damaged something formerly whole and integral, in this case, the boys' prefatory oration. The breaches fragmented whole lines and blocks of text and helped readers to see the body, or in this case, bodies, breaking into and breaking apart well-rehearsed speech. The dash played a key role in the textual presentation of Jonson's Poetaster, 1602, a play that dramatizes the purging of bombast in favor of sound and clear speech. So it's a play all about eloquence and the danger of challenging eloquence. The liberal use of the small horizontal glyph in the play's final scene, which is what you see here, correlates to the physical effects brought on by the purgative physic administered to the pretender poet Crispinus by the poet Horace. So on the stage, the actor playing Crispinus vomits, just gorges slanderous language into a basin word by word, and this would have taken a while. Jonson departs from his source text for this scene, Lucian's Lexiphanes, where the offender's vomiting is described in a couple of sentences. Jonson draws out this vomiting over 61 lines, from Crispinus's first groan to the regurgitation of his 28th word. If this feels excessive, yes, it's supposed to be excessive. Jonson seizes on the dash as a thrifty way of translating the unremitting physical effects of this purge, this great purge, onto the page. The 42 dashes deployed in the service of accounting for Crispinus's vomiting makes visible the physical consequences of his excesses and the incessant physicality of his punishment. So I have one more Johnson example for you here. Johnson's Epicene, or the Silent Woman, proved to be the ultimate test case for Johnson's experiments, since it centers on and derives much of its comic effect from the problem of communicating without language. The breaches, Johnson uses the term again, that appear in the speeches of the irritable character Morose, stretch the potential of punctuation to encode the physicality of performance to a new extreme with a typographical symbol that combined the dash with the parenthesis. So Morose is described as, quote, a gentleman that loves not noise in the prefatory list of characters. He requires his interlocutors to answer him by signs, bodily signs, rather than by speech. In the margin, beside Morose's demand that Mute reply to him, quote, not by speech, but by silence, the marginal direction, and this is the top marginal direction in this image, reads, at the breeches, still the fellow makes legs or signs. So Mute's response to each question or command is represented by one of these breeches. Morose then indicates verbally that he has received the answer he desired. He says good, so, or very good. Readers receive some details about these physical responses. Mute holds up half a finger at one point, for instance, but the text does not always prescribe the precise quality of Mute's legs, which could signal bowing, and signs, which could signal anything from a nod of the head to clowning to a more formal system of manual signing, some kind of sign language. The breeches not only called attention to the intrusion of the moving body, but also graphically circumscribed a degree of imaginative latitude for readers. So it leaves room for readers to imagine what is happening physically in that moment. So the blankness of the breach in Epicene, and as it developed across Johnson's early quartos, is designed to be both evocative and provocative to the readerly eye. Some critics have argued that the breaches effectively foreclose readerly access to the troublesome effects or affects or associations of Mute's gestures that they would have created in performance. But I would suggest that the dashes as blanks allowed Johnson to have his cake and eat it too. So they erase the body, yes, but they also make visible the effects of the body on ordered and eloquent speech. The breaches function, if I can use a metaphor here, as typographic horizons, marks that encouraged a kind of interpretive excess that mirrored the very physical excesses for which they accounted. In making the dashes parenthetical, Johnson simultaneously brackets Mute's actions and calls attention to them as integral to his dramatic conceit. So Johnson's experiments led to a diffusion of dashes in 17th century playbooks to signal all kinds of nonverbal stage business. In addition to accounting for changes in address, tone, loss of words, and rhythms of speech, dashes and parenthetical notes came to be used to signal all kinds of disruptive action. So I'll just show you a bunch of those here. So here we have some more smoking. The character Tobacco is smoking. Go figure. Hiccuping. What is hiccuping? Clowning, coughing, spitting, kissing. Lots of dashes instantiating kissing, fighting, weeping, drinking in English and in Latin, dancing, lewd gesturing here on the word nothing as slang for female genitalia, falling asleep, and more extreme, also dying. What this means is that readers would have known to read the dash as a versatile catch-all grapheme or graphic for the qualities of performance that exceeded language. This meant that it was always available to playwrights, publishers, and printers to register actions of all sorts. Dashes also started to be co-opted to accentuate deixis, a mode of verbal pointing in the way that gestural pointing would have done in performance. They were used in conjunction with words like this, that, here, there, thus, him, her, them, see, mark, etc., which all draw attention to particular objects, spaces, people, or situations. While special characters like asterisks, little star, and daggers, a little T symbol, were sometimes deployed to mark deixis, it was the flexible dash, already pulling multiple duty as the chief indicator of verbal interruptions, asides, changes in address, pauses, tone, and disruptive action that was most often put to this new use. So part 3, stage architecture and space. And I'm finally going to arrive at a Shakespeare example for you. Early modern playbooks are also full of typographic experiments that tend to the meaningful use of theatrical space, entrances, exits, the cleared stage, vertical staging, simultaneous speech and action happening on different parts of the stage, and so forth. Many of these experiments entailed playing around with scene divisions, not a regular feature of playbook typography before the 1630s, to mediate the impacts of mise en scène, especially notable shifts in time, place, and circumstance. The first book of an adult professional play to feature numbered scene divisions was the 1590 Tamburlaine octavo, where divisions visibly carved the play into a series of iterated events. This page design strategy is designed to articulate the iterative and cumulative effect of using the cleared stage to isolate successive discrete events rather than this idea of continuous action. The cleared stage and the scene divisions that textualize these breaks for readers allow for the collapsing of historical time into theatrical time, and thereby accentuate the speed with which the character Tamburlaine stockpiles titles, crowns, prisoners, and power. So they allow for this idea of this vertiginous speed with which Tamburlaine rises to power, from a shepherd to the monarch of all the world, as he says. So in the event that you feel a little bit cheated, that I have not discussed Shakespeare at all yet, I will now turn to what I think is one of the most astonishing examples of printerly attention to the theatrical and hermeneutic effects of mise en scène. Q1, first quarto edition of Romeo and Juliet, published in 1597. I like this example because, like the cases of Pilcrows and indents and dashes, it illustrates the mediating potential of textual abstraction in the face of unprintable theatricality. It also neatly illustrates how accidentals, nonverbal, non-authorial features of the text were used to recuperate the text following a printing house accident. A pretty bad printing house accident. So let's have a look. I can say with some confidence that the earliest scene divisions in a Shakespeare quarto and the last for more than 3 decades resulted from this printing house accident. The printer Edward Aldie, who we've seen before, unwittingly began setting type for the last 6 sheets of Romeo and Juliet in a smaller type than his partner John Danter was using for the first 4. So these 2 printers split up the printing job for this particular book. Danter gets the first 4 sheets, Aldie gets the last 6 sheets. After casting off their manuscript copy text to determine the number of pages required for each portion of the text, Aldie and Danter started printing their allocations in their respective printing shops simultaneously. So let's have a look. You can see here on the left is Danter's printing, and on the right is Aldie's. So you can see on the left, it's a much bigger typeface. And it was this typeface that was used to determine the number of pages required for each. So while setting type for sheet F, the first sheet of his allocation, Aldie seems to have realized that he had a problem. There would not be enough text to fill his 6-sheet quota, And for a job printer like Aldi, not filling the sheets would mean a smaller payday. He therefore had financial incentive to compensate for his mistake. Aldi cushioned the remaining text with extra lines of white space, ample leading around centered stage directions to force new type lines, and by setting exit directions on their own line. So I've tried to isolate some of those strategies for you here. Most conspicuously, though, he generated 12 horizontal bars of what we call printer's lace, printer's ornaments, by iterating square cast type source ornaments across the page. Such ornaments, also known as printer's flowers, had been variously configured and used in English printed books since the 1560s. And by the 1590s, so we're talking 1597 here, would have been legible to readers as meaningful features of the printed page, not for evoking flowers or lace, but rather, as book historian Juliet Fleming has suggested, for helping readers navigate the positioning of writing, quote, within the physical and cognitive spaces that comprise the architecture of the book. Instead of following the precedent of his own printing shop, by situating the lace ornaments above or below the text on a given page, Aldi did something altogether more surprising for a printed play. He used the ornaments to divide the text, and he did so in ways that were sensitive to the staging demands and related thematic concerns of this play's shifting endgame. It has been suggested by one editor of Romeo and Juliet that Aldi situated the bars of lace between the scenes, as if the scene were a stable, definable unit of dramatic form in 1597. It was not. What constituted a scene was completely up in the air at this stage. Numbered scene divisions did not become a consistent feature of playbook design until the 1630s, as I mentioned, which was maybe a symptom of the practical and sometimes incompatible ways that plays were divided to facilitate performance. Scene headings were mobilized in plot scenarios, which you see at the top here, to organize units of dramatic composition, but then plays were carved into units of stage occupancy in backstage plots, which is what you see at the bottom, with horizontal lines signaling the cleared stage. Aldi did not use the implication of a cleared stage as the sole arbiter of dramatic form, and editors have ignored his interventions on these grounds, right? Modern editors say, well, a scene division happens when the stage clears. That's not the principle by which Aldi is using these divisions. In my view, his addition of the ornaments is neither careless nor capricious. Instead, the ornaments create visual barriers between blocks of text that make painfully visible the clever, meaningful uses of stage space and architecture and performance. Given where they divide the text, the ornaments intensify the obstacles of time, place, and circumstance that animate the play's ending. So let me show you what I mean. The first ornaments appear as a pair and together partition Capulet's negotiations with Paris about expediting his marriage to Juliet from Juliet's exchange with Romeo at the window, i.e. aloft, after their wedding night. These ornaments then divide Capulet's expression about what he desires for Juliet from Juliet's expression about what she desires for herself. The lark, she laments, usually makes, quote, sweet division of night from day. But this lark that she and Romeo are hearing doth not so. She says, this lark divideth us, as the light in yonder east, in Romeo's words, do lace the severing clouds. So for readers, the inky impression of another kind of lace, the printer's ornaments here bound their night close and closed and buffered this, their final exchange from Juliet's parents. After all, the next ornament cordons off this block of text, Romeo and Juliet's last exchange, from Lady Capulet's joyful news that Juliet's wedding to Paris is imminent. On the one side of the ornament, Romeo bids goodbye. The nurse warns Juliet that her mother is coming, and Juliet, quote, goeth down from the window, which you see on the bottom of the left page. On the other side, at the top of the facing page, is a description of Juliet entering with her mother and the nurse. The exact staging logistics of this transition are not described in the quarto, but that hardly matters for readers. The ornament affects a visual distinction between outside and inside, window and bedroom, night and day, and in terms of staging, above and below. It also realizes in typographic form Juliet's divided loyalties to husband and family. On the one side is Romeo, and on the other is her mother, reminding her to obey her father. The ornament refuses to act as writing at the same time as it fundamentally alters how the writing on the page can be read. The next 6 divisions also affect breaks that evoke the significance of stage movement and render more legible missed connections and misunderstandings within the fiction of the play. For example, this ornament implies a cleared stage and a change of fictional location from the friar's cell back to the Capulet's house, but it also divides Juliet, now in league with the friar, from her mother and father, who believe her to have agreed to their plan. On the one side of the ornament, she plans to defy them. On the other side, she kneels down and repents the sin of froward, willful opposition. Another ornament then notes a shift to Juliet's bedroom, where she is eventually left alone to take the friar's potion. She drinks it and falls upon her bed within the curtains, a stage direction only in Q1 you see at the top of the right page. The ornament following this description is the first to be situated where the stage does not actually clear. If a bed was thrust out from the tiring house, it would be, in Leslie Thompson's words, a conspicuous presence on the stage as the rest of the household prepared for the wedding early the next morning. The ornament therefore marks not only the division between night and day, but it is also a proxy for the curtains separating Juliet's quote-unquote dead body from the activity of the people who believe she is still very much alive. So I did a little experiment here. And Aldi could have used a combination of other space-wasting techniques to fill out the page. And on the right, I've tried to simulate what that would look like if he didn't use the ornament, but used extra lines and leading and all sorts of things like that. But he didn't do any of these things. He opted for the visual affordance of the lace ornament instead. The ornaments that follow separate 1, the Capulet house in mourning, from 2, Romeo and Mantua learning of Juliet's death and procuring poison from the apothecary, from 3, Friar Lawrence's realization that his plan has failed. The latter, seen here, reminds readers that Friar John, with his letters of great weight, and Romeo are very much not in the same place. And this is the tragedy obviously hinges on this particular detail. While these ornaments articulate discontinuities in fictional time, place, and circumstance, the last 2 ornaments in the quarto divide the sequence of events that play out in the churchyard into 3 discrete units. Romeo's slaying of Paris and then his own suicide, the friar's appearance to check on Juliet and her suicide, and finally the convergence of the play's remaining characters on stage. Modern editors, including Lucas Erne, in his Cambridge edition of this particular edition of the first quarto, consolidate all this action into a single unit, since the place of the action never changes, and the actor playing Juliet on stage is on stage throughout. However, in erecting 2 typographic barriers, one between Romeo and Juliet, and one between the lovers and their parents, Aldi, the printer, in effect brings, once again, the missed connections that spur the play's catastrophe into sharp focus. Lace ornaments are among the most printerly of all pieces of type, because unlike letters, numbers, and punctuation marks, they play no role in the construction of semantic or linguistic meaning. They do, however, transform the final pages of the first quarto of Romeo and Juliet into spaces where non-semantic meaning is vital to understanding dramatic situation. In other words, Aldi's forced typographic experiments, forced because of the mistake he made, make visible the expressive uses of stage movement and architecture that should have and might have otherwise been impossible to render textually. Aldi used very same or similar cast type ornaments in other books for decoration and generic cohesion, such as here in Samuel Daniels' play Cleopatra, or to fill up space in the trimming of Thomas Nash, which he printed the same year as Romeo and Juliet. In fact, these are the same ornaments he uses in Romeo and Juliet. He could have used the ornaments in this way in Romeo and Juliet, but he didn't. Consistently dismissed as accidentals, that is, vagaries of the printing process that obstruct editorial desire for an uncontaminated authorial text. The lace ornaments both resulted from a typesetting accident and came to articulate the way performance intensified the effect of accidents within the fiction of the play. Aldi used them to correct a technical printing error while remaining alert to the way they could make legible in typographic form both lovers' estrangements from family, life-saving knowledge and each other. He showed that and how it was possible, or it might be possible, to lay a scene in print. So I'm at my conclusion now. It is widely accepted that the conventions of what might be termed dramatic typography began to settle at the beginning of the 18th century. And yet, there was at least one editor who never stopped playing with the possibilities of movable type to make theatricality legible and thus the text read as a play. In 1760, Edward Capel published a small volume of, quote, editorial experiments called Prolusions, which included Edward III, a play thought to be writ by Shakespeare. Praised belatedly in the 20th century for its, quote, typographical elegance, the book was a prelude to Capel's much larger editorial project, a brand new 10-volume edition of Shakespeare's comedies, histories, and tragedies. This was finally published in 1768 after decades of work and was quickly eclipsed by Edmund Malone's 1790 landmark edition of the works. Enlisting as his printer Dryden Leach, who has been called the father of British fine press printing, Capel innovated with book and page design to put his revolutionary editorial principles into practice. Capel was the first editor to systematically collate as many of the earliest editions of Shakespeare's plays as he could find, and to select what he called an established text, what W.W. Gregg would come to call a copy text, as the basis for his editorial work. Previous editors, previous to Capel, by contrast, had based their work on the most recently published edition, with some deference to the folio tradition. Capel was very interested in these early quarto editions. In Prolusions, Capel tested a novel typographic scheme for recording this painstaking work, making his Edward III the first edition of a play to feature collation notes. The trial run worked, and Capel implemented his protocol in Shakespeare. Prolusions was in every way a playful exploratory project. For instance, it was among the first English books to be printed on wove rather than inlaid paper. Wove paper, which wouldn't come into common use for another 3 decades, was much better suited to finely cut typefaces, such as Baskerville and the Caslon that Leach ultimately used. These are still typefaces you can use on your own computers. It resulted in a cleaner, crisper impression, which is what Capel favored. But Capel's commitment to neatening up the page didn't stop with the materials, type, paper, and ink at his disposal. He bristled at what he called, quote, the paginary intermixture of text and comment, and so stripped his editorial page of annotations and relegated them to separate volumes. So what you see here is Samuel Johnson's edition on the left, which has all those notes at the bottom, and what you see on the right is Capel's rendering of the text, where you have no notes. There's no mixture. Perhaps the most notable feature of his attempt to declutter the page was the development of a system of glyphs, of symbols, that could account for a range of non-lexical effects in lieu of marginal directions, so added stage directions, which Capel called, quote, a blemish to the page they stand in. These new marks included an M dash for irony, a subscript M dash to note a change of address, double inverted commas or quotation marks to distinguish asides from public speech, a single dagger or cross to indicate a gesture or other action, and a double dagger, a double cross, to signal the transfer of an object from one character to another. Capel first experimented with these symbols in a performance edition of Antony and Cleopatra in 1758, also printed by Dryden Leach. The edition was attached to a David Garrick production, and the placement of the symbols could well show how Capel attempted to record the physical and tonal particularities of that staging. However, Capel's wider implementation of the system in Edward III and ultimately in his Shakespeare edition was not dictated by specific productions of the plays, rendering the placement of the symbols a product of Capel's own sensibility as a reader and a book designer, rather than his memory of or prescription for performance. So Capel does not explicate what each mark signifies in either the Antony and Cleopatra volume or in his Shakespeare edition. In fact, he insisted that while even, quote, the most attentive reader might misread tone or action without the help of the symbols, their utility, he claimed, was so intuitive that it would, quote, occur immediately to the reader without explanation. So you would look at the symbols and know what they mean. You don't need anyone to explain to you what they mean. Capel understood what typography could do for printed drama, but he was impatient. He believed that the typographic change could happen overnight, but we know that it cannot. He had too much faith in readers' willingness to learn how to read new typographic arrangements. The long and short of it is that Capel's typography demanded too much and explained too little. Unlike Johnson's breeches, which took hold slowly over decades and included explanation at the beginning, Capel's symbols were too much all at once, and his typographic ambition became one reason for his edition's failure. Although the Capel-Leach system of typographic symbols marks the first comprehensive attempt to codify the theatricality of Shakespeare's plays in print, English play readers had already been heeding typographic arrangements designed to help them intuit aspects of ostensibly unprintable theatricality for almost 2 centuries. Early modern playbook typography has been dismissed, both because the disposition of printed matter on the pages of these books is inconsistent, even awkward and messy to the modern eye, and because print has long been treated as an obstacle to the project of recovering what Shakespeare actually wrote. These playbooks were not made to record performance, just as they were not made to record Shakespeare's or any other playwright's pure vision for the play. They were made for readers by printers and publishers who were themselves readers. If we adjust our ways of reading to focus on processes, not product, we will come to see that decades and decades of experimentation, of prolusions, little rehearsals, of playing with type before the play to make the play, made text written for one media environment, the theater, suitable for another one, that is the book. Thank you very much for your time. I would welcome any questions about this or anything else that you are interested in. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. Can you see that? 10%. Okay. There we go.
Okay, there you go. Thank you very much, Claire, for this illuminating reflection talk. Well, I'm certain that we learn a lot, and it's so beautiful to see how things that we take for granted in our experience, for example, in editing text in Microsoft Word, I think most of us named that symbol where we show paragraphs in Microsoft Word that we accidentally turn on sometimes, and sometimes people don't know how to turn it off. And I think we all have met Pilcrows before, and it's so nice that some things that we take for granted, the blank space, then the transformation of Pilcrows and blank space, and the division, and how the page set up the arrangement for the readers. And one of the things that I was thinking through during your talk was that when I first give grammar to my students, for example, the first thing that I teach them is how to read grammar. And in some way, how to read grammar is the history of practical typography, or how to understand the signals. So that's one of the things that we do all the time, and via textual arrangement, we can have a look on how these things came to be what they are today. So it's so beautiful. It's illuminated for the reader. We have some questions here. Okay. I'll start with our own Jessica Shiva from Shakespeare Institute. She was here as a moderator. She was our first speaker for seminars back in June. And she says, I wonder where Shakespeare's apparent lack of input in the printed process makes it less likely we find any experimental features in the printed text, the printed versions of his work in comparison to Johnson, other than those that are at the printed experiments, fewer dashes and so on. Mm-hmm. Could you talk about this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I conducted this survey I tried to look at one copy of every edition of every play published between, earliest is 1512, Fulgens and Lucrece, all the way to 1709. And one thing I did note as I was doing that survey was how sort of typographically banal, we might say, or ordinary Shakespeare's printed plays are. They very much, as a group, or on the whole, conform to the kind of ossifying conventions of dramatic typography by the 1590s onwards. So you don't. It is very interesting that we do not get a lot of dashes in Shakespeare's plays. There are a couple of exceptions. The 1622 Othello has a lot of dashes in it. That may have to do with its being a King's Men play. We know that Ralph Crane, as a scribe, starts to use a lot of dashes in his manuscript, so there may be a connection there. There are some choice dashes in the first folio, especially in Julius Caesar. I talk about this in my book right at the end of the chapter about dashes. Every death in Julius Caesar by stabbing, there is a dash, which is really interesting. And then Nicholas Rowe takes up the dash quite aggressively in his 1709 edition, both of Caesar and of the other play. So by 1709, there's the dash. If you look at Restoration playbooks, not just of Shakespeare, like Aphra-Behn's plays, dashes are just everywhere in those plays. But the early editions of Shakespeare, there are a few localized experiments. I do talk about the 1611 Pericles, which is a third quarto of Pericles, if I'm remembering correctly. There are some Pilcrows there, and I attribute that to a kind of type of what Zach Lesser has called, in relation to black letter playbooks, a kind of typographic nostalgia, right? Pericles is a play that harkens back to an earlier moment in English literary history, and the Pilcrows, which are very outmoded and outdated by that point in playbooks. I suggest that they might be there to stress the kind of nostalgic quality of having Gower narrate the play. But in terms of there's nothing to the extent that you see in Johnson's plays, in Shakespeare's plays. And that may very much have something to do with the lack of an author being involved, or something about the the roundabout textual transmission of those manuscripts, the varied textual transmission of those manuscripts. But on the whole, I would say that Shakespeare's quartos, other than obviously the Q1 Romeo and Juliet, Q1 Othello, Two Noble Kinsmen, which is much later, first quarter of that, 1634, obviously posthumously published. Also very interesting typographically. There are a couple of asterisks that are quite interesting there. But for the most part, Shakespeare's quartos very much conform to what we would probably call the conventions of dramatic typography in the 1590s and early 1600s. So I did look for more experiments in Shakespeare. The next book, I have a few more in my pocket that I'll save, but there are some other ways in which the pressures of printing Shakespeare, so the transition from quarto format to folio format actually have very meaningful effects on the way the text can be and comes to be read in the editorial tradition. So an editorial tradition that relies on quarto play text, for example, looks different from an editorial tradition that relies on the folio because of that narrow column not being able to accommodate side-by-side arrangements, for example, of stage directions and speech, and puts them as kind of sequential. So stay tuned for that. I'm still working that out in my mind and in my practice. So yeah, thanks for the question. I hope that sort of got at the question a little bit.
Thanks, Claire. We have another question for Murat, who is also a participant at seminars, and he asks you to talk about DEM shows. And the typography for DEM shows in printed play text. He thanks you in advance.
Okay, so I have not personally looked at DEM shows too carefully. I know that Tiffany Stern is doing some work on the textual presentation of DEM shows. What I can say about DEM shows and other kind of inset, what I would call inset text. So the description of action in a DEM show, which is more than a stage direction, right? The insetting of letters or proclamations or other kinds of like extra textual text. The convention that comes to be associated with that is typographic differentiation, so typeface differentiation. So the setting of those embedded moments or embedded texts in a typeface that's different from the typeface that's being used to render the dialogue. But in terms of, I don't want to, speak beyond my expertise here, but DEM shows and masks are, I sort of left those aside. I mean, masks are so complicated and different from professional drama typographically. I do talk a little bit about, in the book, Davenant's interregnum entertainments, is kind of like operatic entertainments and some of the typographic experiments there. But I sort of put masks aside, and I knew that Tiffany was working on DEM shows and their typographic presentation, so I sort of left that to her. Yeah, I would send you in that direction rather than try to stumble through a kind of incoherent answer myself, except to say that printers are very much paying attention to the affordances of different typefaces in making sure that readers are aware that the thing that they're looking at, the description of the DEM show, is categorically different from dialogue. So this is another thing we don't think too much about because it's so ingrained, it's so normalized, even in modern editions. But at some point, someone had to make a decision to set the type of the DEM show in a different typeface. So I would say that that's like the limit of what I can say about that. And I'm sure Tiffany has much more, illuminating and intelligent things to say.
Many thanks. Still in the line on how to read plays, I think it would be nice for our audience today. If we could talk about list of characters or the dramatis personae. When did it started? Which is the first play that included a list of characters? If you have an idea of how well received it is, because it's one of the features, again, when you teach that, have by your side the list of characters, and things will be easier for you while you read.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the purposes of my project, I counted that as a paratext. So it wasn't I noted when there was one and when there wasn't. Tamara Atkin and Emma Smith have a wonderful piece in the Review of English Studies about the history and design of dramatis personae lists and character lists. So I can summarize what they say. Pre-commercial theater drama, you get a lot of character lists, and those character lists are usually designed for future performance. So here's how you double characters. Here's how you play this play with only 10 people when there are 25 characters, for example. So those early lists are really about facilitating performance. But then when we get to the commercial theater plays, it's actually quite rare. Johnson is always the exception that proves the rule. Actually quite rare to have character lists and lists of dramatis personae. And then they pick up again, I want to say around, I'm thinking about Atkin and Smith's piece around the 1630s, and then by the time you get to the Restoration, it's expected that you would get a character list. The first folio has a few character lists, and I often use those. I ask my students to compare, like the Othello character list, which appears at the end of the play text. They typically appear at the end when they do appear in the folio. Compare that to like a modern character list, and what sort of assumptions the character list makes about its characters that then shapes the way we read or think about the character. But one of the main points that Smith and Atkin make in their piece, which I think is really helpful and interesting, is the way that characters are hierarchized from the 1630s onwards in these character lists, right? By gender. So male characters listed first, female characters listed second, by rank. So it doesn't matter if you're not the character with the most lines. If you are the king or the duke, you get listed first. The way that characters are described as well, usually relationally. So like you'll have a king, and then his queen is referred to as his queen, not by any other distinguishing characteristic. So I agree that they are great teaching tools on these early character lists, because they reveal all sorts of assumptions about how plays or how character is thought about and constructed. Johnson again uses his sort of like character sketches I think quite differently from the way that the character list or dramatis personae later develop. But I think for me, looking at character lists, it's almost as much about what is not said as what is said. So like, is Hamlet, is the ghost in Hamlet, is he called Hamlet's father in the dramatis personae, or is he just called Hamlet's ghost or ghost? That matters whether dramatis personae. And in Epicene too, like this is a great Johnson example. It gives away, right? Epicene, the great thing about the play Epicene is this revelation at the end that the silent woman is actually a boy in disguise. But the dramatis personae gives that away. So as a reader, if you read the dramatis personae, you don't have the surprise at the end. So it's interesting what is revealed and what isn't revealed in those. But I would, again, there are other people who know way more about this than I do. I simply read their work and I teach it and I use it in my own work. But Tamara Atkin and Emma Smith's piece is really, it teaches beautifully too, and has lots of great illustrations of what they're talking about. And it goes all the way from these early lists that facilitate performance, right, that are thinking in a future-oriented way, to character lists that are more retrospective, that might even include the names of the actors who played the roles. We sometimes get that as well. So.
Thank you very much. We have another question that I think opens for lots of different answers and other questions. Let's go. It's from Marli Fernand from the audience, can we say then that editorial projects combine interests to meet the different reading contexts in which the books circulated?
I love this question because it's something that I'm thinking a lot about at the moment in my own editorial work. I think that modern editors are becoming more and more sensitive to the importance of design of the early texts in their edition. And the question is, like, how do you account for that? Because I'm working on an Arden edition of 1 Henry VI at the moment, but Arden has just like most publishers of modern editions, has a fairly strict set of editorial rules and principles that not only have to do with the treatment of the text itself, but how the text is laid out. And being involved with Arden, we've had a lot of discussions about, what would you want the text to look like? How can the text, how would you get the text to reflect some design feature of, say, the folio that would get lost otherwise? So digital editions are, I think, an interesting horizon for thinking about how to mediate or how to reconcile early design features which are inconsistent and, as I said, messy. It doesn't mean they don't matter. I think they do matter, but they're inconsistent and messy, and that clashes very much with the editorial desire for consistency and convention, and readability and legibility and accessibility too for the readers of these texts. So I'm working on this digital humanities project right now, which is we have a copy of the Beaumont and Fletcher 1647 folio here at Penn State. 3 of the plays are marked up for very early performance. So the kind of goal of this project is to generate digital editions of this copy, right? So that's all well and good to say we want to generate digital editions of this copy, but what does that even mean, right? How do you produce, and to say we want to produce editions of the plays from this particular copy, but we want them to be able to be used in an undergraduate classroom. Those two things don't mix. Like they really don't. And then when you think about all the editorial principles that you come up with, and then how that clashes with the strictures of XML and TEI encoding practices and guidelines, it's really, really, really challenging to preserve something of the copy text in an edition that is also clean and consistent and accessible and usable in a classroom. So I don't have the answers, but it is. I love thinking about this question. I think it is the question. This is when I think about what I hope my work will do, like the effect of this work and this research is to have editors think about this, to think twice before they say remove a dash. Just to take a very simple example, remove a dash from a speech and replace it with a stage direction, for example, or just with a period. Or I want editors to kind of think twice and say, well, is this meaningful? Give the text the benefit of the doubt before you say, I don't understand it, it's just a mistake. And so this is what I'm really thinking about in the second project is how what we think of as error is, yes, it could have been a mistake, but it still creates meaning. And so how do we embrace that? I'm learning very much how to dwell with messiness and inconsistency, and it takes a lot of practice and a lot of patience. But I hope that's one larger effect of my work, is to appreciate the intellectual and creative labor too that goes into designing, right? That we tend to not see compositors and printers as intellectuals or creative types, right? We see them as functional or like pure labor, but that's not true at all. That they are highly engaged in the text that they're printing, and I think editors need to be alive to that and attuned to that. This is why I think Appel is so interesting as a figure, because I think he did understand that. So it's a shame that his edition was such a failure. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. And keeping on the big wave, you said something about the wish to how the play looked like, and all your talk was much more about how the printers or the print house had an idea of how they wanted the play to look like. So we as editors sometimes share this desire for some visual with pre-editors. So I'm taking a point that it was a comment right here that would go as far as to point those printers, those people setting up the page, as some kind of proto-editors of Shakespeare, for example. Yes?
Yeah, I think I would ascribe that kind of agency. I mean, this relates to Sonia Masai's work, right, on the unnamed editors of the 17th century, who are, she's more interested in the way that words change, right, how people go in and improve and perfect copy for the next edition. And she's interested in how words change, right, how the language changes and shifts over the 17th century and kind of recuperating that labor. And I'm more interested in the design dimension of that. So this is also why, and I'll just make a little case here, why there's this fetish around first editions, and right, like we must always privilege the first edition because of its proximity to the author, so to speak, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, I think that second and third editions can be way more interesting because you can isolate, you can't say exactly who made the decision, but like the Edward Aldie like will to like example, right? That's clearly the printer making those decisions in this third edition. So I think it's almost easier to isolate non-authorial agency in later editions than it is in first editions, which is why I think we need to focus on those later editions as well. I think they're really interesting sites of graphic experimentation. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Thank you. And we move to our final question, and that's something that the audience asked you to talk more about Milton's Shakespeare or Shakespeare's Milton.
Yeah. So this is the project that's been taking up a lot of my time for the last year. So I'm collaborating with Jason Scott Warren at Cambridge. So for those people who don't know the story, I wrote a book chapter about this copy of the Shakespeare First Folio, which is at the Free Library of Philadelphia. It's heavily annotated in an early hand. I managed to date the hand to the 17th century through various bibliographic means. And I wrote an account of the reading practices that we see in this book. I didn't know who the reader was. There's no provenance material in the book that would allow you to know who the reader is that I could see. But this article was published, and Jason Scott Warren saw it and saw the images, and he saw provenance evidence, which was the handwriting in the book. He said that looks very much like John Milton's handwriting. And so that was the beginning of this quote unquote discovery. I mean, this book has been known since 1899, but Jason was the first to see, right, the annotations and say like, hey, that looks really similar. So we're in the process now of, we've been working for almost 18 months now on gathering our evidence for this attribution. And we're fairly confident in it at this point. So we're in the process of writing up our article that will shore up our case for Milton as the reader. But it's super interesting. Milton is collating the folio against fifth quarto editions of Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet. They're intertextual references to Purchas's Pilgrims and to songs and sonnets to the book we now know as Toddle's Miscellany. There are brackets in every play except 1 Henry VI, 2 Henry VI, and Titus. Every other play has some kind of intervention. He's added a missing stanza of a song to Measure for Measure. He's added in the prologue to Romeo and Juliet, which isn't printed in the first folio, but he adds it in a very early hand. So it's probably one of the first interventions he makes in the book. And my favorite little detail is he titles it The Prologue to Juliet and Romeo, not Romeo and Juliet, to Juliet and Romeo. So I love that little detail. But it's a very rich volume. It both shows Milton collating, it shows him making changes without recourse to other texts. We've obviously known Shakespeare's influence on Milton for a long time. There's been this implication of it, the way that Shakespeare bubbles up in Milton's works, but this allows us a new context to understand that influence and that relationship. So I am not a Miltonist at all. So one of the things that this project has done is sort of channeled me towards this crash course in Milton. So that's, I think it's really important to always remain a student. You become an expert in something, and then I think it's always good to have this opportunity, if not the time. I feel like I never have enough time, but the opportunity to constantly learn new things. I don't think there's any point in being in this profession if you're not constantly a student as well as a teacher. So that's been a great gift to me over the last 18 months. And also working in collaboration with Jason has just been a pleasure. So we work so much in isolation in this profession as editors, as researchers, that the ability to work on a project like this with somebody, again, is a real gift. So stay tuned for the article. And if you go to my website, there's a whole list of the news coverage of this. Jason and I did a podcast last year about it. And if you go through my Twitter feed, I'm at Roaring Girl with an E on the end. You'll find links to some talks that we've given on the subject. So I think we've given 7 talks this year on the material. So yeah, stay tuned. It's a work in progress.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. It's been a pleasure. It's been a very beautiful afternoon having to talk about text, Shakespeare and Milton right now. And thank you for your time. Thank you for our audience, for the questions, for the interventions. Thank you for all these long weeks together at Seminários. And if you are following us from a different country, thank you very much. We are going to switch back to Portuguese in a few moments. So I'd like to express my gratitude on behalf of the team of Seminários for Claire and all the questions and our spectators around the world. Thank you for making Seminários so great a pleasure to communicate and to interact with so fantastic topics, fantastic scholars, and fantastic people. Thank you, Claire, for being here today. And thank you all for the privilege of handling this material, handling this kind of conference in such a troubled times, and this keeps our bonds together, keep the community in some way together, exchanging and open for discussions. So thank you very much. And so thank you, Claire. By the way, all the links to Claire's website, her monograph, her links, reference, even the slides, if it's okay, we can send them to our lists as we do weekly with the material we usually send. So don't worry if you lost anything, some kind of link, some material that she referred. You can write us and we can get this material to you. So don't worry. Write to us if you have any questions or anything that appeared on Seminários and you want the reference, you want the link. So, Claire, do you have anything else you want to talk about your book, about where we can get the book, or your Twitter handle? You want to?
Yeah, I'd be happy to send all that info to you if you want to send that to the list. But I don't know if Oxford University Press is having a sale for the holidays, but you can buy the book on OUP's website. Also, there's information about that on my website too. So yeah, I'll send you all that information and you can distribute it if people are interested. So thanks for that. Thanks for having me. This was really fun.
Thank you. So if we're switching back to Portuguese right now. Então, se vocês não, a lista de presença está disponível aqui no chat. Quem precisa de certificado, só assinar. Lembrando que nessa lista vocês podem nos indicar pessoas, temas, tópicos, fazer sugestões, indicar conteúdo que os seminários podem trazer. A gente vai ter um período de pausa. Hoje é o último seminário desse ano. A gente retorna em janeiro, né? Logo a nossa programação de janeiro e fevereiro está no ar, está no Facebook, está no Twitter, está aqui no YouTube, você pode fazer as inscrições. A gente segue com a programação, a gente segue trazendo conteúdo. Né? Para você não perder nada, lembre-se de se inscrever no canal, de clicar no like, ativar as notificações. Toda quinta-feira a gente coloca um material novo, um material de alguma palestra que foi feita nas semanas anteriores. A palestra de hoje ainda vai levar algumas semanas para ficar disponível, mas materiais das semanas anteriores, né, de um mês e meio atrás, eles já estão ficando disponíveis, né? Como os seminários, esses materiais também são disponibilizados semanalmente. Então, toda quinta-feira, geralmente no fim da tarde, tem um vídeo novo de alguma palestra anterior. Então, se você está animado, está contente, você está como eu, fico muito feliz com esse momento de troca, pode seguir maratonando com os nossos vídeos, vai aparecer aqui na tela para vocês, assim que acabar, vai aparecer links dos nossos vídeos. Você pode seguir, temos vídeos de área de literatura, ensino, tradução, linguística, né, toda a variedade das letras. Aproveito para agradecer por esse ano junto, né, a gente está juntos desde junho desse ano, né, e tivemos palestras todas as semanas, né, tivemos milhares de pessoas, dúzias de palestrantes, moderadores, pessoas alcançando o Brasil todo. A gente publicou um vídeo recentemente, um vídeo do Descobrindo Seminários, onde tem alguns dos nossos números, dos nossos alcances, e tudo isso é só possível com vocês que acompanham a gente, que participam, que se inscrevem, que vêm, que participam, que comentam, que divulgam, que passam para seus amigos, que repassam nas listas, mandam nos seus grupos de mensagem. Vamos continuar com isso, vamos manter tudo funcionando, tudo rodando. A gente, durante o distanciamento social, a gente continua com essa de trazer esse momento de troca, esse momento de manter todo mundo trocando, manter todo mundo junto, né, nessa variedade, nessa riqueza das letras. Tá? Muito obrigado a todos, boas festas para todos, sigam conosco, lembre-se de seguir a gente nas mídias sociais, aqui no YouTube principalmente, para facilitar, né? Vocês recebem nossos vídeos, recebem as notificações do material novo. Muito obrigado a todos, desejo então boas festas a todos vocês. E a gente se vê em 2021 nos seminários abertos das letras da UFSM, em nome da Daiane, da Angelica, da Juliana. Agradeço a todos pela presença, a todos pelas longas semanas, né, pelas maravilhosas semanas juntos. Muito obrigado a todos.